all suffering kind of looks the same in
Mm.
the sense that you can see the patterns of like that self-centeredness, that fear, that collapsing in on oneself. But our freedom is really looks so unique. Because when we get out of that navel gazing, like, I'm so scared because of this thing that is happening only to me. Meanwhile, millions of people are diagnosed with cancer every year. That I can start to be like, oh, well, then what do I do with this? And my creative response to it is entirely unique. It's going to be very different than anyone else's response to it. And so I love that as a way to also remind us to not stay in that fear because it is so basic. Fear is
Fear is
so
so
basic.
basic. Welcome to Cosmic Clowns, a podcast about exploring consciousness, surviving chaos, and finding the comedy in it all. I'm Jocelyn K. Glei. I am a writer, a teacher, an energy worker, and someone who is trying to find an equal balance between fierceness and tenderness.
And I'm Sebenai Selassie, a writer, a teacher, a lover of tarot, astrology, and all things mystical, a burgeoning crone, and an immigrant weirdo. In today's episode, we will be exploring the connections between scared and sacred, two very different words with one letter shift. We'll share about how we can reconnect to the sacred in times of fear, talk about the difference between fear and anxiety and how to navigate both, and how scarcity can drive the scaries. Also, I'll share a surprisingly powerful quote from Tom Cruise. We're grateful for your presence and excited for this episode. But first, let's check in. Jocelyn, how are you doing today?
Well, as you know, I am in the process of selling my house right now. So I'm a little bit untethered. And yeah, a couple days ago, I really lost myself for a minute. As I was reflecting on it after I'd gotten a little more perspective, I was like, oh, I just kind of like forgot who I was for a second there.
Hmm.
And I was really lucky in that I was talking to a friend, and I'm very fortunate in that I have this really part of my community is this group of amazing queer healers. And so I was talking to one of those friends, and she offered to do an impromptu energy session with me. And so we did that, and it just really was able to help me recalibrate and help me ground. And so I'm just feeling really, really grateful for that community and just grateful for those resources. That's just so incredible to have access to people who can help you ground and rebalance your energy system. Yeah. So.
Yeah, well, I've witnessed your community firsthand in Woodstock, and you've
Mm.
found a very magical group of incredible beings. So I'm happy you have that as a resource in this time of change that you're going through.
Yeah, so lucky. And just to be clear, I'm not leaving the community. Just going to try and find a rental.
Mm.
Um, and how are you today?
I am, as I was saying before we started recording, a bit tired. I think part of it is just the season shift and the temperature change, and yeah, body getting used to that. I've also lost a lot of weight this year, which is somewhat worrisome when you have cancer, but
Mm.
it doesn't seem to be, life threatening in any way. But it does mean that I'm colder than I was like 8 months ago. So, yeah, just kind of navigating like, how do I take care of myself now? And uh, often find myself like wishing for a hot flash, which is,
How
a
times
strange thing
change.
to wish for. Yeah. um, and yeah, but overall, looking forward to the teaching I have coming up and the projects I'm working on. So that feels nourishing. even though it's a
Mm,
bit tiring.
yeah. Yeah, well, and I can relate to the coldness as someone with a sort of like whippet-like body. I'm constantly, as I am right now, in scarves, more neckerchiefs, I think.
Yeah, neckerchiefs.
It's a fun word. So where do we wanna start today?
So, yeah, um, this connection between scared and sacred, that one letter difference, I remember us texting about it, I don't know, a couple of years ago. Yeah, I'm curious what you think about that difference or where that connection takes you.
Yeah. I mean, for me, I think I'm really thinking about it as seeing them both on a spectrum, kind of at either ends of the spectrum, and thinking about how much when we are scared, when we are in that fear state, when we are, maybe frozen, maybe fawning, like how much that disconnects us from the sacred and how it is so difficult to access the sacred when we are in that mindset. Um, so that's kind of the first thing that came up for me. And then I think also just thinking about what is sacred? Like, what does it mean to me? What does it mean to you? What does it mean to us? Because I think we all know what it is to be scared. That doesn't seem like, at least to me, that doesn't seem like something that, needs a lot of definition necessarily or clarity. But what is sacred? And
Mm.
just for me, going back to the definition and, thinking about what is holy, what do we really hold dear, what is precious, mm, and sacred as what we really want to draw a boundary around and regard as inviolate, right? Like this cannot be violated. We all have those points where we're like, okay, like you can take this or you can take this or I'll tolerate that, but like at a certain point, it's like, okay, that's where I draw the line, right? Um and coming back to that idea of holiness, I was also thinking about holy and wholesome, right? Wholesome with a W, like what that there is, I think, a connection between the sacred and what allows us to feel whole, to feel integrated, to feel like we are really in our bodies and connected to earth. Yeah, so those are all the things that were coming up for me. What about you in terms of scared versus sacred and just what is sacred?
Yeah, I like starting with this idea of what is sacred, and you pointing out that like a lot of us know scared already. You know, maybe too intimately right now in terms of being in touch with our fears. And I think that we don't have like a lot of education or training around what's sacred, kind of in the larger, let's say, more um, general culture. Some of us maybe have grown up with spiritual traditions or religious traditions that have
Yeah.
particular definitions of it, but I don't feel like as a larger culture we have a shared understanding of what's sacred. And so sometimes I think what's can be defined as sacred is only things that are deemed like immaterial and spiritual,
Mm,
so that it's sort of this transcendent idea of what's sacred, like the Father God in the sky, or whatever conceptions we have of what's quote unquote holy, or certain books physically even will be considered sacred and others will not. And so what is that, like what is that distinction that a lot of religions and cultures make around kind of sacred and profane? And I think we're talking about something different, you and I, when we're pointing to the sacred, that there's an inherent kind of numinous spiritual quality to life and existence that makes all of being sacred. And that's a big tent idea of sacred that really allows us to include everything in the idea of sacred. That's my definition of sacred, that there's an inherent sacredness just to being here, just to existence. And so for me, that becomes, a real moment by moment treasuring of life. And whether that's the plants in my apartment or, I always light candles before a teaching or recording and kind of tend to my altar and tend to my space in ways that honors that I'm about to enter into, a sacred practice. But everything can be a sacred practice. And, around more traditional cultures or indigenous communities, there's so much blessing that happens. Like you bless the water, you bless the land, you say prayers to the space, you say prayers to the ancestors, to the people. Like it takes a really long time, or I'm thinking of the Thanksgiving address that Robin Wall Kimmerer describes in Braiding Sweetgrass, that the Iroquois Confederacy School. I'm forgetting the name of the actual tribe right now, but up in upstate New York, the kids like K through 12 say this Thanksgiving address every week, and every week it's a different grade that says it, and it's so long that a lot of times when they have visitors, the first people are like, for the first kind of descriptions of like thanking the sun or the earth or the plants, like people are like, oh, this is so sweet. But the longer it goes on, you can see sort of people who aren't used to it, like, this is really long. But there's so much sacredness in everything, and in every breath and in every meal. And yeah, so that kind of attention to life as sacred to me is such a challenging practice in our day and age, where we don't have not made the time for those kinds of acknowledgments, but also so necessary for us to really come into contact with it.
I love what you were saying about that big tent idea of sacredness and that it's just part of every minute of being. And I was just thinking about this idea that, in order to access the sacred, we really do have to be present, right? We really do have to drop into this um, deep presence. And when we're in that kind of rigid fear space, or we're really like up in the head, we're really not in the body, there's a very kind of physical, energetic aspect to how difficult it is to access the sacred, I think. And the other thing that I was remembering as you were talking was that we can define the sacred in so many ways. And I was writing a note when I was thinking about this podcast, and I wrote sacred as definition, but my phone auto completed it as sacred as sedition. And I was like, "Ooh, okay." Like, "Hmm." And I think there's something really interesting there in that kind of, the idea of how powerful the sacred is and what a threat connecting to the sacred can be, and therefore to keep the collective in a state of fear or in a state of anxiety, that there's great uh, utility in that in terms of suppression.
Yeah. Yeah, I have a saying, the revolution will not be desacralized. And I wrote in my most recent newsletter about how I always saw sacred in sacralization or desacralization, but I hadn't really made the connection as the sacral is in our second chakra. And so
Yeah.
that destabilizing is really cutting us off from that connection to earth and our root powers, and also our sexuality and the erotic, because that's so much of what sacred is that connection to the feeling, sensing body that can experience everything. That the numinous is not just this transcendent up in the clouds kind of heaven experience, but it's in our daily connection to the earth and to food and sex and love and connection and laughter and joy and all of the things that our bodies are designed to do.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think about the sacral chakra as sort of hearth of creativity, right? That eros
Mhm.
is the root of all generativity, right? So connecting to the sacred as such a deeply generative place as well, right? As we're trying to think about new ways of being, new ways of connecting with each other, new ways of relating to our planet, relating to Earth, et cetera, right? Like we need that connection to the sacred and to the sacral in order to access those kind of that that generative fire.
Mhm. Yeah, and, there's probably gonna be a theme ongoing with this podcast in general, but how much we've been deconditioned from that and conditioned into, as you said, like a more intellectual, head-centered way of being that is, um, really, emphasized by the obsession with scientific materialism and really making everything have to be about evidence and, excuse me, material reality. And the sacred is the mundane, right? Which is, we sometimes use that as a pejorative, but it's really pointing to the earth, like the mundane, and that's a part of the sacred too. That it's not either or, and actually our bodies are the only way through into that, right? We can't experience the transcendent except through our bodies, and so that connection is vital to any sense of spiritual development.
Yeah, absolutely. And I was talking about, doing that session with my friend, doing some energy work with my friend at the beginning, and I think that when we're in that scared place, when we're in that fear place, it is, as you say, like it's a very heady, intellectual sort of space that it keeps us in. And I think that part of connecting to the sacred and really just part of like navigating these times right now is really understanding the importance of our bodies as energy systems, as things that are constantly like passing through, holding, releasing energy. We are electrical systems, right? Like it's electrical pulses that operate our heart, that help us operate our muscles, that fire in our neurons. And if we think of ourselves as sort of these rechargeable batteries, so what are we connecting into and what are we like recharging with? And like, what is that energy that we're putting into the system? Like I was talking to a dear friend the other day who is dealing with a lot of anger lately. And we were talking about how, he really needs some practices to just to move it, like to move that energy. And and we were talking about that idea, and I kind of like talking about energy because it's kind of neutral. It's like no judgment. It's like just move the energy, like whatever it is, if it's grief, if it's anger, if it's anxiety, like sometimes to understand our bodies, as energy systems, as opposed to just intellects where we can have mind over matter, then we can understand like, oh, I need to do some practices to kind of move this energy through my system. Or, oh, I'm spending so much time on social media, like I'm recharging my energy from social media. Like, what does that mean that I'm putting into my system? Maybe I need
Mhm.
to be putting different energies into my system. Yeah, that was something that was really coming up for me thinking about this as well.
Yeah, 100%. I mean, there are those studies that show, emotions have a half-life that's a few, I don't know, tens of seconds. I can't remember the exact amount, but not even a minute, let's say. But
Yeah.
it's our stories and our conditioning and patterns with having had experienced that before. And so looping it, if we just let the emotion run through us, it would dissipate. And, some of us can experience that through practice, through meditation, or through other kinds of contemplative training, that those patterns that we think are set for life or, that's just the way I am, they can be deconditioned, they can be altered. And to me, that really points to also the difference between fear and anxiety or rumination or these patterns of behavior that turn what is a natural, as you said, energetic response of fear, which is just a bodily response to danger. It is completely natural and necessary. It's wired into us for a reason. It's on hyperdrive because we live in cultures and in societies that really hijack that and for all sorts of purposes to get us to buy more stuff, to feel bad about ourselves, to condition us to, work like crazy for fear of perishing. There's a lot built into the systems of our society that really amp up that fear to levels that are not just sort of responsive to the environment in a natural way. And so, yes, how do we ourselves create our own processes and systems so that we create boundaries around what we let in that will amp that up, right?
Yeah, and I was also thinking about the scared end of the spectrum, the connection to this idea of scarcity, and as you're talking about kind of all these different ways in which we're conditioned to be in a state of fear. There's a really fascinating book called Scarcity, um, where they research folks who are experiencing money scarcity. And then they also research folks who are experiencing time scarcity. So who are just, hyper busy and under stress in that way. And the impacts are incredibly similar. And the sort of overall result of when you're in this state of scarcity is a kind of tunnel vision, right?
Mm,
Like you're not able to be forward thinking, you're not able to be innovative, you don't necessarily make good decisions. It's really difficult to take into account long-term thinking. And so you're making these very like kind of short-term based decisions. Um, and I think uh, pretty much everyone is fits into like one of those categories, right? There's either we're experiencing, some sort of money scarcity, or you're experiencing some sort of time scarcity, and or you're maybe experiencing both of those types of scarcity. And I feel like scarcity is just so baked into this culture, right? Being in that mindset, and there's a real way in which that again works against that kind of sacred, sacral, like generative way of showing up and of thinking. Like it really, really depletes us.
mm. Yeah, as you're saying that, first, I should probably point out for anyone who's wondering, we're not scientists. I know, I know we may sound like scientists. We're scientists of the soul. Um, but when you were saying that, I wonder if there's also, along with time and money scarcity, like love or connection scarcity that is
Mm.
driving a lot of people's fear as well.
That is one of the other themes they talk about in the book is
Okay, yeah,
loneliness. Yeah. Mhm.
I am a scientist. I'm a scientist. Um, and how wired in that is for us. I'm sure ancestrally, evolutionarily, like, of course, you couldn't front load creativity and all of these other
Yeah.
capacities when you were alone because you got separated from your group or you had so little food and you knew that you had to get to the next place to find food before you could survive. So there's so much wired into us that we're working against in a lot of ways, and then that's amped up by the culture because of course there are people who have very little materially and are suffering in our world more and more so.
Yeah.
And for those of us here on this podcast, me and you, that's not our reality. But we still suffer from that level of fear and anxiety that's woven into a culture that makes us feel like we're going to perish if, we're not sort of super busy all the time. The scarcity is conditioned into us, and so that we think if we're not working all the time that, we're going to be on the streets.
Yeah, absolutely. And this kind of theme of, loneliness and separation that you're bringing up, um, one of my practices maybe over the past year or year and a half has been to um, sit with what you might call the mundane plants, right? There's a lot of talk of kind of sitting with plants that are more psychedelic, but just sitting with, some of your everyday plants and making a practice of sitting with like a tea from the plant and kind of seeing what it has to communicate to me. And so I was doing that practice with yarrow, um, I think maybe this spring, and the message that came through really strongly for me was sacred is not separate and also separate is not sacred. And that one message just kept having so much resonance for me. But a lot of it was around the idea of healing and the power of healing in community. And this is something you and I have talked a lot about, right? But that like all healing is relational because all of our wounds pretty much are from being in relationship. And for me, I've spent so much time just as a creative person, as a entrepreneur, doing everything on my own. And I think there also is a bias in the dominant culture towards like an individualized approach to healing, right?
You
Like
think
most
so?
people, a little bit, like most people are not used to healing. We feel like, oh, this is something I go over there alone and I do. And, maybe even then I'll fix myself before I come back to the community, right? And so that idea of sacred is not separate, and that really kind of came in along with, for me, there's just been such a message lately of like, you're not going to figure it out alone, and really, um, embracing community on so many levels. Yes, in terms of healing, but also in terms of other things. And like, look, here we are doing this collaboration, right? My last podcast I did by myself. I don't really want to do everything alone anymore. Um, but yeah, I think for me, there's been so much richness in thinking about that idea of sacred is not separate.
Yeah, I love that. Um, that tendency towards individualism in our culture, which shows up in so many ways, not just healing, also fuels the fear, right? Because then we don't know how to share, we don't know how to be vulnerable with each other, and it's only recently, maybe our generation, that has like really adopted therapy. But even before that, you wouldn't even tend to what was bothering you, just sort of
Yeah.
suck it up and keep going, yeah, tamp it down and
Mhm.
get on with it. So there's a lot to just acknowledging that we're scared. And one thing that came to me in considering this episode is really, can we be scared sacred?
Ooh, say
Like,
more.
so, well, I think a lot of times, I know for me that my practice, my meditation practice, my spiritual practice really deepened when I was first diagnosed 20 years ago. So I'd been on the path for many years before
Mm.
that,
Mhm.
but it was the, diagnosis of stage 3 cancer at 34 where I was like, oh, I need to like step this up. And,
Mhm.
this question, if all fear is the fear of death, which many
Mhm.
people, quote or say, um, that kind of fear, that mortal fear, when it puts us in touch with the sacred, it's an opportunity. And
Yeah.
can we use any fear? Can we harness our own scaredness for our own sacredness? And I know for me that was really helpful to turn to ancient teachings and to wisdom traditions as a way to navigate what is scary, particularly
Mm.
death, but all fear. And one thing that I often think about when I think of fear is in the classical Buddhist teachings, metta, metta, or loving kindness, is the antidote to fear. Like the Buddha
Mm,
purportedly gave that practice to monks who were scared because they had been practicing in the forest and they, heard some tree spirits or something that freaked them out, and that's what was given to them. And so that kindness, that attention to self, that um, extension of that kindness to others and to all beings is the antidote to this fear that we
mm,
always move through the world with. Again, fear is natural. And can it be also helpful for the fear that is, let's say, it's not unnatural, it's still natural, but really conditioned or patterned into us, again, because the culture wants us to keep us scared,
mhm, mhm.
wants to keep us unsacred.
Sacred is sedition.
Sacred is sedition. That
Um,
we're gonna have to come up with a line of t-shirts.
absolutely. Um, yeah, when I think, to your point, what you were talking about being scared, sacred, m maybe that's part of, sort of if we're zooming out to the cosmic, right, that's part of the larger purpose of things that are unfolding now, which have us in such a fear state. Um, and I also think that so much of what is happening is really pushing us towards more connection and more community, which you were just talking about as well, right? Like we are, uh, to me, it just really feels like part of the larger purpose is to um, really make us understand in such a deep way our own interdependence and to push us towards that. Um, to take us out of this, super individualized mode of existence that we've kind of been conditioned to be in for so long.
Yeah, and I love that because that orientation towards a larger whole takes us out of our solipsism, and our navel gazing. Why would we want that?
I don't know what you're talking about.
um, that there's a way in which we start to understand that our suffering is not special. We of course are extremely special, very
Mhm.
very special, but our suffering is not. I was talking to someone I work with, DJ, who was telling me about this teacher, Matthew Brensilver, who I don't know, but I've heard of, a Dharma teacher. And he was talking to him about how, or maybe it was in a Dharma talk, that all suffering kind of looks the same in
Mm.
the sense that you can see the patterns of like that self-centeredness, that fear, that collapsing in on oneself. But our freedom is really looks so unique. Because when we get out of that navel gazing, like, I'm so scared because of this thing that is happening only to me. Meanwhile, millions of people are diagnosed with cancer every year. That I can start to be like, oh, well, then what do I do with this? And my creative response to it is entirely unique. It's going to be very different than anyone else's response to it. And so I love that as a way to also remind us to not stay in that fear because it is so basic. Fear is
Fear is
so
so basic.
basic. Can I share the Tom
Is
Cruise
this leading
quote?
into your Tom Cruise quote?
Yes.
Is that where it
This
goes?
was in my friend's Dan's email to yesterday or today. I can't remember, but so Tom Cruise, as we all know, is famous for doing all his own stunts because he's a madman. Um, so what he says about it's so great. He says, "I'm afraid, but I'm not afraid to be afraid."
Mm,
And I just love that because it really absolves us from this idea that like courage doesn't have fear and that bravery or creativity doesn't have fear involved. It does what it doesn't have is the anxiety or the
mm,
rumination of staying in
mhm.
that place that, that's solipsistic. Let me look at my belly button as I try and do this, and I can't see anything because I'm looking at my belly button.
Yeah, it makes me think of there's a Georgia O'Keeffe quote that I really like that is, something like, "Of course I'm afraid. I'm afraid all the time, but I never let it stop me from doing anything."
That's where Tom
Um
Cruise got it. He's such a fighter. Totally ripping off Georgia O'Keeffe. Tom.
Oh my gosh. Did you watch that video about, like, the behind the scenes on that motorcycle stunt where he drives off the cliff? That's
No, I
so
don't watch
wild.
Tom Cruise videos.
Just I
I
just
just
share his
quote
quotes on
him.
my podcast. Well, what you were saying was also making me think of in your book, in You Belong, you talk about another letter transposition, right? So we're talking about scared versus sacred and the sort of moving of one letter. And you talk about creative versus reactive. Can you say a little bit about that? Because it feels like it's kind of coming in a thread from what you were just talking about a
Yeah,
little
I
bit.
was, like, journaling years ago, and I was writing it out, and I just noticed that difference, and I love that both of them have the C move. So the question is, like, what is that C? Like, what is that about? Like, that C seems really important, and I think it is a lot of things. It's connection, it's compassion, it's capacity, it's consciousness, it's clown, it's cosmic. C, 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 C. But, it points to the fact that these, realities, reactive, creatives, scared, sacred, are so connected. Maybe we can be scared into sacredness, or we can be reacted into creativity, that there's kind of a limit to those finite destabilizing conditions. Like, if they don't kill us, they will turn us towards our truer, better self in a way.
Yeah, yeah. One of the questions I wanted to ask you, and I don't know, I think we've talked about this in different ways, is how do we transmute scared into sacred? Any thoughts on that?
Well, to bring it back to that C, I think consciousness is a lot of it. And, I'm not talking about sort of big C consciousness, although that is definitely part of it, but just that capacity to be aware, to really bring our attention, our love, our devotion to our lived experience, not to be stuck in these ruminations, these thoughts that take us to the future or the past and bring up the anxieties and the fears, but really what's happening now. And, I really do not recommend cancer. It's a bad C. But it is a really profound training ground for that capacity, because I
Mhm.
can't stay in scanxiety or fears
Yeah.
constantly. I wouldn't be able to live my life with any sense of presence. And so it's been such a fire hose of a deep teacher.
Yeah, yeah. You're making me think of, one of my teachers said, "Fear is a really expensive fuel." And I think about that a lot. Anxiety is also a really expensive fuel, a fuel that, my body is prone to running on, in some circumstances. And, yeah, to think about the toll that that takes on us to be in that state. Um, and it is really, as I said earlier, like, I think a very kind of when I think about the way that we are sort of conditioned to live right now, I think about this idea of, like, living in a headlong manner, when you're just really, like, leading with the head and kind of being pulled forward by that, and, um, if I were to draw it, it would even be like then putting a screen kind of in front of that head, right? Like, it's sort of like we're being led around by the nose. But yeah, that headiness and that disconnection, from the body that it can put us into, um, feels like a really key part of staying in the fear place or staying in the scared place. Like, if we're able to come back into have the awareness to see that we're in that state, as you say, and then kind of come back into the body and find ways to get more grounded. I think that's sort of a crucial part of that transmutation.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, our trauma responses are in our bodies, and if we don't know how to regulate, to come back to a sense of just safety and breath and being, we'll always be run by that kind of headlong state that you're describing. Because, and again, this is not true for everyone in terms of scarcity or threat. There are a lot of people under threat right now, but for those of us who are not in immediate physical or even psychological danger, in the sense that we're not experiencing abuse or attack in particular ways, then yes, establishing that sense of groundedness and centeredness is vital, because we can't help those who are under threat if we're constantly
Mhm.
dealing with a body that's on high alert and alarm when it doesn't need to be. And that's not to dismiss that some people have had those experiences, and that might be personal and familial and come from childhood experiences, or it might be ancestral and intergenerational, might be karmic. There are all sorts of reasons why our bodies can be dysregulated, but tending to the fact that in this moment we can actually heal that dysregulation so that we can show up with less activated, unnecessary fear is key to anything, really.
Yeah, absolutely. And for some reason, I'm kind of looping back. I'm thinking about, we were talking about scarcity earlier and time scarcity. And one of the things I was thinking about with that is there was an interview I enjoyed with Rick Rubin, and he was talking about how when he meditates twice a day, he feels like he has more time, right? And so, like, the ability, as you're saying, to regulate really creates so much more expansiveness and allows us to get out of this kind of super, mm, I guess, kind of more protected, kind of frozen state. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think that's even more true right now, because we are being fed so many fear narratives. And again, these are actual fears and terrors for people, and then the rest of us are witnesses to that. And so, how do we stay informed, know what's going on, try and help in ways that seem reasonable and doable for ourselves, but not get completely dysregulated by this? Because I also don't want to pathologize dysregulation, because
Yeah.
it makes sense that we're dysregulated right now.
Yeah.
And
Well,
it's
not
up to
everybody
us.
has the same tools, or the same
Exactly.
resources, right?
Yeah. But it is our responsibility to ourselves and each other to not stay in that state.
So, what are you doing differently these days in terms of responding to that, right? The kind of rising tide of, you know, chaos and fear-based information. And how are you kind of dealing with, like, finding that regulation in maybe new or different ways?
Well, as you know, this year, one of my main mantras has, and soon to be in our merch line t-shirt, is no news before noon. Um, and so this entire year, I have never looked at the news before 12 p.m. And sometimes, it's 11:40 right now, or 11:39. Sometimes it'll be like 11:50, and I'll be like, should I look? And I don't.
Mhm.
I really protect my mornings as spaces for me to get in touch with myself and to um, regulate my system. And another thing is this little barker. Do you want to come up here? Come here. Come on. Come on.
Cha-cha's here, everyone.
Yeah, he's making himself known. Okay, you can either come up. All right. Um, Hopefully that'll get him to stop barking. This has been really regulating to
Mhm.
have this little guy in the mornings. We spend, our morning routine. is many minutes of kisses and cuddles in the morning, um,
So
which is
important.
so important. Living alone for 3 years now, which I haven't done very much in my life at all,
Mm,
is has really having him has really made me realize how important connection is, and that can show up in different ways. I'm very connected to my plants, very connected to my friends, and then making plenty of time for self-care of food and movement and, all the various, herbs and tools that help regulate my body, but also my practices of meditation, of tarot, of sacred study that, really support me in having that cosmic view of things. Um, and we've
yeah.
we've talked about before how astrology gives us that perspective that, okay, things are fucking crazy right now, and, um, these are patterns that have happened throughout history, and, we aren't the first to deal with tyranny and with disruption, um, and oppression, and we, unfortunately, will probably not be the last.
Yeah, well, and that what you're talking about, the no news before noon, again, it brings back that idea of, like, the boundary, right? That we make things sacred by drawing a boundary around them, and that's how you that
Mm,
sacred morning space for
yeah,
yourself, which is so powerful.
yeah.
Um,
How about you?
for myself, I've been noticing, um, I mean, of course, my practices, right? Like, I feel like it's such a kind of a spiral around sacredness. I think about
Mhm,
my dog before he lays down for a nap, and that kind of the twirling and the twirling and the twirling before you can settle in. And I have just been finding myself needing to do more and more and more practices. It's like the before maybe 1 or 2 layers was sufficient, and now, it's like 3 or 4 or 5, like, kinda depending on what's going on throughout the day, and not necessarily something, super long or in depth. It could just be, I have a very basic breathing exercise that I do to calm the nervous system, and it's, you know, 8 very 8 very, long and in-depth, sort of breaths in and out, just little things like that to regulate the system. And also for myself, I've really been noticing the change in my habits in terms of my attention and what I'm consuming. And because I think I was spending so much time by myself, I started to listen to podcasts more, kind of have them on when I'm cooking or things like that because it kind of feels like company in a way. And noticing kind of how the quality of that company is kind of shifting as the quality of the news and what, everyone is talking about is shifting. And so just realizing like, oh, I think lately, oh, I think I need to choose quiet more. Or I need to choose silence more because this is really kind of, flooding some things into my system that maybe are not nourishing me. And, I think uh, I have this metaphor that I think of for consciousness is sort of like something we have to constantly shore up. Like it's kind of like like the consciousness is say, let's like a pier over the ocean. And the ocean, the tides are kind of constantly coming in and sort of eroding the sand beneath the pier. And so we need to do these practices of kind of constantly shoring up our consciousness. And for me, part of that is like looking at what's right, like, oh, let me look again at like what I'm doing in terms of like my inputs and my outputs, to kind of um, shore that up or see if that needs to be, there needs to be some adaptation. And that that just feels really important right now, right? To be so mindful of what you're taking in, how you're taking it in, how you're clearing things from your system, what your practices are, all those pieces.
Yeah, yeah, I love that. Okay, another idea, a trucker hat with "practices, practices, practices" written on it. Um, I really resonate with the podcast thing because I too, use podcasts as a way to not feel silence all the time, you know?
Yeah.
It's so different than living with a person where there is that continual interaction over the day or working with people. I work alone pretty much. I've noticed myself unsubscribing from news podcasts. I mean, I was never huge into news podcasts
Yeah.
anyways, but podcasts that tend towards that orientation,
Mhm.
and listening to many more spiritual podcasts and podcasts about witches and you know um, astrology and we all know the astrology podcast has 7-hour episodes sometimes. There's plenty of content
They'll
to
keep you
listen
company.
to. It will definitely. I definitely am a Chris Brennan stan. That man is amazing.
Oh my god,
Shout
what a
out to the
resource.
astrology podcast. Yeah. But yeah, I really love this idea of the boundary of sacred that is not so much what's outside of it is not sacred, but it's almost like a garden, a place to cultivate these things that then can inform the rest of the landscape as well. So
Yeah,
yeah.
yeah. Is there anything else that you want to, explore before we wrap up this episode?
No, I think that's good. I feel like every question will be a new can of worms of scary worms.
Who who knows what will come out?
Really.
Well, so maybe to wrap up, to get a little away from the scaries, from the fear, what is bringing you joy or bringing you laughter or bringing you lightness lately?
So lately, I am very into Josh Johnson,
Oh, yeah,
who,
you mentioned him. I had to look him
yes,
up.
he's a Daily Show correspondent, and I think he recently hosted for the first time, which I didn't see yet. But he is like a stand-up machine. He has so much content on YouTube. His YouTube page is incredible. He's just constantly putting out new content. He's on a tour right now called the Flowers Tour, which is so cute because every time
Mm.
you watch one of the longer pieces from that tour, wherever he is, whatever city he is, he has women kind of dressed up in these like kind of I don't know, Bridgerton looking to me gowns and handing out flowers to everyone, which is just
Oh, so
adorable.
nice.
He's so sweet. He's probably in his 30s, but he looks like he's about 12, a black guy from the South. And and he's just hilarious. And every show is so different. And he's kind of riffing on, different topical things. He touches politics, but he'll also just like riff on, his friend getting food poisoning when they went to a diner, and he's just so funny and so sweet and so charming, and I just adore him. So Josh Johnson, check him out.
Josh Johnson. All right, I am gonna look into it. Um I don't think I have any I don't know if I have any media recommendations, although I did check out the studio after your
So
your
good, right?
recommendation last time, yes, oh my god, and the casting episode was completely amazing.
Genius.
Catherine Hahn is so incredible in that episode.
Hmm.
Um, what is bringing me joy? What is bringing me lightness? Um I mentioned at the top, feeling very untethered and in flux. And I actually went back to, you had recommended an astrologist for me to connect with around the timing on selling my house. And I was just revisiting the exchange that we had had about that. And again, this kind of idea of, cycles and that larger cosmic and even astrological perspective is bringing me a lot of comfort right now, like knowing that Um, I am really in what I think is probably at the beginning of a very lengthy new cycle. And part of what's happening for me now is that I'm really laying the foundation for a new way of kind of living and showing up on so many levels, like literally where I'm living in my home, but also how I'm showing up professionally. Um, and I am a Capricorn rising, and so I'm, like, such an overachiever, and I'm so, like, always really fixated on, like, how much have I gotten done and wanting to do more, and, um, having this really, like, zoomed out perspective and understanding that I'm laying, like, these kind of fundamental foundation stones for what is probably, I don't even know, 7, 8, 10-year cycle or something like that is really bringing me, um, some comfort and kind of helping me put things in perspective right now. Yeah.
I love that. Yeah. Yay, astrology.
Yay, astrology, constantly bringing us comfort because we know we're right on time when things are hard.
That's right. That's right.
So helpful. Well, thank you everyone for being here for this episode. We really appreciate you sharing your precious attention with us. If you want to continue to stay in connection, to stay in touch with myself and Sebene, we are both on Substack. She operates a beautiful newsletter called Remind Me to Love. I write under the name Radiate on Substack, so you can go there, follow us, subscribe. We would love to have you floating in our orbit. And it would also be amazing if you could rate and review this show. Reviews really help new people discover us. We want to keep doing this. Apparently, we have a whole merchandise line that we need to create. So I think we need to keep doing the podcast in order to create that. Yeah, so please share your reviews, share your feedback. We would be so grateful. Yeah, just a reminder to keep it cosmic and to find lightness, find comedy, find clowning where you can. And we'll send you off with this final moment of clown.
Like, I have a question. Is like, is all fear just a fear of death? I don't want to start with that one. You know what I mean? Like,
No, I definitely don't think we
yeah.
should
So.
should start with that.